my research is mostly on teaching, on teachers of mathematics in secondary school, and I've been looking at the teaching of geometry. And so I haven't looked at any online teaching or learning. So this is something new. So what I tried to do was, if I were to apply the same kind of ideas or what I look for when I go to a classroom to see teaching, what would I do? So so I'm doing this exercise together with you to think about what would I find. And pretty much what I'm going to talk to you is this idea, that this construct that I use as the collective memory of the math class. And talk about, when I look at the online geometry course, what resources I found about the process of building this collective memory in the math class. And pretty much at the end, what I'm going to be talking about is to brainstorm with you about ideas for future investigations. So pretty much following what we talked about last week. So I'm going to be looking at these elements of the design of the online geometry course that George has put together, and how is it that design helps students to remember geometric concepts and procedures. And in order to see what's different about the online course, I mean, it's useful to have side-by-side two things so that we can see what's here that is not there. And so what's in the online course that is not in the face-to-face course. And I use this idea of the collective memory of the math class, which is this assumption that a teacher tries to create what I call a privileged representation of the past, or tries to make sure that they convey what students should remember and what students should learn in the class. And for that purpose, the teacher makes some actions, and when I go to a classroom, I look at what actions the teacher is doing in order to make sure that he can say or she can say, I taught this, and this is what you should remember, and this is what you should know, and what prior knowledge are you using to build upon your lesson of the day. So based upon that, what I tried to do is, with the Net Geometry course, I tried to see, well, what resources enable the construction of a collective memory here? What kind of things are there that pushes, that the teacher can say, this is what I want you to remember from the class. This is what you should learn. And so this is sort of the overview of the course. I look at the materials online of the course, and these are sort of the main themes of the course. These are some of the requirements that include, and this is an important piece, some skills, some things that students should be able to master. And this is important in terms of the things I found, that the support that there is for students to remember things or make sense of things that they need to do. So in terms of what there is there to remember, well, there's mathematical concepts and propositions. I mean, some theorems are important that the students should remember. There's also some mathematical procedures that they should remember. But there is also specific instructions about how to use particular tools, because the class uses all these different components. It's important that they remember how to do X or Y with a particular tool. And also there's strategies for solving specific types of problems. Those are things sort of like they should remember. And when I looked into the resources of the online course and the face-to-face course, because I should say as a background that when I came here, my first semester here, I visited on a weekly basis George's class. He was gracious enough to let me just go there, sit there, and see what was going on. So in a way, my basis for comparison is what I saw there in the class, the things that they did in the class, and how they pretty much use some resources, but also the book of the class, right? So if you compare the online resources with the book, what's different there? And in the online courses, there are the hyperlinks. There's also the dynamic diagrams that they can click on the interface and sort of work with them. But there are also videos from class discussions, which is different from in a face-to-face class that you may have to record what happened in the class and put it somewhere. But in online resources, there's some videos, and we're going to see that. There's some screenshots from class discussions that, because the discussion happens online, you can sort of keep a record of what they talked about. Some of the tutorials, self-assessments are sort of equivalent to, doing a problem in the book and look at the answers in the back of the book. And there's some things about the organization of the text that could be the same in both environments. So I will unpack each one of these to say a little bit more about how there's some design components here that are meant to support students to sort of remember things. So for example, in this text, when the students are reading this unit, they encounter the main collinearity lemma. They also have it here, the MCL. And it's in blue, so if you don't remember what it is, if you want to refresh your memory about what this is, you can click on this. And then you find this big blue box that has, what this is about. If it's different from looking at a book, because when you're looking at a book, you'll have to go to the back of the book and search that's an important concept and look at what page did you talk about it and go back. But here is like instantly there that you can sort of look at the definition right there. So you can have some sort of non-linear reading of the text where you're jumping back and forth. But already the fact that you're highlighting this in blue means that as a student, you get the sense that I'm expected to remember this. I should know what this is about. This is an important concept. Whereas maybe in the book, unless it's in bold or something like that, you may not get the clue that this is something I need. So, that's characteristic of online text. Also, the use of dynamic geometry diagrams that in the book, if you're reading the book, you cannot drag around the figure and see what happens. But here you have something KSEC, and you have the formulation of this Hardy's theorem, which is, for some students, could be, okay, what does this mean? And unpacking all these symbols. But right there, you have a diagram. But you don't just have this diagram, you have a KSEC diagram that you can click on and drag, and if I get off here, you can see, you can, drag these points, move them around, and try to have a better understanding of the theorem that it's, with this dynamic diagram that is very different from having the book. Right, a static diagram, so you can see, oh, what happens if, how can I get this point down here and things like that. They can start looking at different interesting things with the dynamic diagram. So so there's also videos from class discussions. And that's important again because usually when we have a face-to-face course, there's a class discussion. People may remember it, take notes on it, and try to remember what this is about. But here you have an actual reproduction of something that happened in the class. So for example, this is one of the class discussions. So you have a sense of this resource, and you can expect that a student who was part of this discussion and did not understand what was going on can go back and review the video and see what can they learn from the video. It's different from what happened in class that you have to remember and to reproduce what happened there. I think this idea of screenshots from class discussions is important because maybe if you're giving a class, you're not going to make color copies of for people to see the diagram and the different things of the diagram. But when you are, if you have a screenshot of class discussion and you have a really interesting diagram like this one that has different colors, and the colors are really important for you to understand different things that you need to pay attention to, it's a very different resource. So that's another resource that happens in online discussions that doesn't happen necessarily face-to-face. Tutorials. I can show you an example of this one, but a tutorial that is also a small video tells you how to use a particular, how to use text wins in this case, and students can go back and check different things that they're doing and check their procedures. In terms of self-assessments, you can expect that this is similar to what a student would do when they're working on the book. In the book, there are particular exercises, and when they're solving the exercise, they can look in the back of the book to see if they're right. Here, when they click, there's a during exercise, a question, and then say, here's the answer. The student is supposed to be working on the answer, and then click show, and then the answer is right there, right? So in a way, I think that that's similar to what happens when the student works on a book problem and looks at the back of the book and sees the solution. So there's not much difference between these things. So yeah, so the self-assessments are very similar to what you can see a student doing in the book, checking if their answer is correct and going to the back of the book, clicking here. And there's some things about the organization of the text, right? And that's similar to what you see in the book and in math books. You're reading a math book, you encounter a blue box, and you know that you need to stop, and that this is a theorem that you probably need to learn, and you need to understand, and you need to memorize. So, in that sense, the design of the online environment is very aligned with what happens in books, that important definitions, important propositions are going to appear in a different font, in a different color, highlighted in a different way, telling the students, stop here, learn this. So these 7 elements are things I found there in terms of things that, resources that it seems that the teacher is doing, the instructor is putting together for students to know, this is what you should remember, this is what you should know. Now, I'm thinking that the next level, it doesn't seem that we have answers about this, is how do students use these resources? And are these components related in any way to students' learning strategies? The way in which they use these components and how they use them? And also, what design elements could be modified or added to increase students' learning opportunities? So in that sense, to think about, is there some sort of theory or way of thinking about how to put together these online resources that would increase students' learning opportunities? Are the uses of these different resources attached to the type of learner that we may have? And I don't know the answer to this question, and my expertise is not about online learning. So I looked into some sample studies and online interactions to see what is it that they do. What is it that they do to measure the relationship between students' opportunities to learn and the design components of an online program. And this may not be math specific. I actually didn't find many things that were math specific, so it seems like it's a new territory, so it's good. Either I didn't know how to look for those, or there's nothing, so that's a good thing. Especially something like this, right? A geometry course that has some diagrams, has many other components that are more just that, producing symbolic notation or getting the solution to a problem. So, for example, I found this study that talked about, so what they did is that they did cluster analysis, so they had all this data about things that are like an index for student learning or a proxy for student learning activities. So the total time online, the course duration, the average session, the proportion of time on learning resources, things like that, the exploration. It was more about the time that they spent doing these things. And they related that to, and I was thinking, how are they doing this with student learning? But they're correlating this to student satisfaction, which is similar to what you said last week, that there's a lot about their satisfaction of a product. If there was learning transfer, the previous experience that they had with some sort of online resource, their learning preferences. And the interesting thing is that when they found 3 different sort of clusters or different kinds of learners. Learners that were mastery-oriented or self-driven, who knew how to navigate the resources. Learners that were task-focused, they say, or try to get something done. And the ones that were, they call the minimalist or the procrastinator effort. I mean, so of course the measures that they have of learning are very vague and they're not related to any particular content area, but they were able to identify some sort of traits or learning characteristics that were related to the way they navigated the online resources. Yeah.
The question, do these 3 clusters relate at all to any sort of face-to-face analysis of clusters of students that...
No, this was just to the online.
Right, but similar studies I assume have been done in face-to-face sort of courses, right?
Mm-hmm.
Identifying types of students, and I'm just curious if you know if these particular clusters, like mastery-oriented students, which we do see, or procrastinator students, which we do see here, if those also appear in face-to-face courses.
Yeah, I didn't see them.
Yes.
They probably exist, yeah, but
53 years of college teaching, I can assure you the answer.
There you go. You got the answer. But they didn't try to make a connection. They just tried to see what were the patterns of using these resources and try to see how were they using them.
Is cluster analysis a new word for factor analysis?
I think so.
Okay, so multi-dimensional mapping, and then you reduce the dimension down to 2
to see where
standard unreliable methods. Okay.
So, for example, this other study tried to figure out the relationship between domain knowledge, the knowledge of a particular. Actually, they took like education students who didn't know about, were supposed not to know about something, and tried to see how they navigated hypertext. And one of the things that it's interesting here is that high knowledge readers use strategies that are similar to those strategies that are competent readers, that they read something and go back and forth and connect. So in a way, they were keeping track of how people were reading these online materials, going back and forth. So I was thinking, when the students in the net geometry course are reading a text, do they go back and forth and go back and click to the hyperlink and look at the definition of something? Do they go and see the diagram, or do they go back and forth? How do they make connections with these different things? Because we know that the things are there, but I don't think we know how they're using it. Yeah, so that's some of the things. There's another study tried to look at some characteristics of the learner, their prior knowledge, they call it self-efficacy, and their interest, to try to see how is it that connects with, their learning opportunities, and also, the control that they may have over the environment, the things in the environment, the instructional design, and things like that. So I'm mentioning this because when I was studying the materials, I was thinking, how could one assess whether they're using these materials, and how is it that they're using it, and what other components could there be here? And one of them could be, the prior courses that they had before the geometry course, if we had some information about this, because I think that's one of the questions that maybe are asked at the beginning of taking the course, or the experiences that they had, or so sort of try to map characteristics of the learner that may tell a little bit more about how they use or they do not navigate these different materials. The other example is from the physics group that maybe some of you know. I know a little bit about it, but they started doing this. It's a very different context, but they started doing this, we call pre-flights, and so because students were not reading the text, they asked them to read the text beforehand, before the lecture, and do these exercises that will get, they call them free flights, and get some sort of assessment and questions about the text. And then they tried to study what was the performance of students who had pre-flight questions and students who were not, did not have any pre-flights. And between the ones that had this access to these pre-flights, students who actually looked at the materials and students who did not look at anything.
Excuse me, is pre-flight the technical word for what they're doing? I mean, gladding is
Yeah.
across the street.
Yeah.
This is being done at physics, right?
Yeah, they call it the pre-flights.
Okay.
So, so one could think about when they're taking the net geometry course before they go to a session, do they navigate the materials beforehand? Do they actually read what they're going, is there before coming? And if you can think about, how much time do they spend reading the materials? Do they click all the hyperlinks? Do they open this and that? What do they do? And does it have a difference in terms of their performance in the course or something like that? So, so I've been thinking about future questions. Could be some things like.
Did they come to any conclusions?
The conclusions were that by comparing the performance of, so 2008 students on pre-flight questions did better than the ones that did not have pre-flights.
Okay.
But the ones who had access to pre-flights but did not do anything, like didn't really read them, were the same as not having pre-flights.
Okay.
So in a way, they're saying that pre-flights really help them to increase their performance in the class.
I remember gladding only answers questions that were asked by the students. They do not necessarily cover everything in their lectures.
In the pre-flights or in the class.
In the class.
In the class, the only questions are answered are the ones that the students answer.
And so that doesn't seem to hurt the students who don't study. They do just as badly. Is that the conclusion? You see, what I'm trying to get at is, do I save anything by writing up the lecture very carefully? And so one thing, but I don't have any, I've never tested this. I don't repeat myself in class. Just, it's there, you can read it. So if gladding actually found that there was no difference, that's wonderful.
It's if they would read it, then they would do better.
Well, if they would read it, they would do better. That's the whole point of it.
That's what they sort of found.
See, the thing is that you came across nothing that talked about Plato.
Well, I wasn't looking
Yeah,
at
because
that.
see, gladding is one of the, I think he may go back all the way to Plato. Physics has been using the system for a long time, using different online methods. Plato was the first. So,
But do you have any evidence whether the students are actually reading the lectures?
well, that's what, yeah, we're trying very hard to figure out how to make sure that they do, short of the pop quiz.
Because it seems that they have something that every time they read it, they log into something and you can measure how much time they're spending. I mean,
Yeah.
you don't know if people are logging into this and go to make a sandwich and come back. I guess that's no way to know this unless you have a small camera, right? And that would be obnoxious, I guess. But I think, well, in terms of data, that would be like an outlier there. But
In other
it
words,
won't be a pattern. But
would you say that the assessment of all of these wonderful new methods lags the methods in wonderfulness?
I'm not understanding.
Well, look, people are coming up with it. What? Say again?
We're not on the same page. I don't understand what you said either.
Oh, okay, I'll try to say it again. See, it buys time. There's a great deal of innovation. The NSF pays a great deal of money for innovation, but the assessment of these innovations are not very persuasive. To measure amount of hyperlinks clicked on, number of minutes, in fact, these are all, that's like,
No, they're usually correlated with student performance later.
yeah.
Or what I've been finding is that more than student performance, they also do like students' appreciation of
Right.
the course or students' satisfaction. So it's similar to what you said before last week, that is more about their perception of something. So they could have a great grade or a horrible grade, but it's about their self-perception. It's very hard to do that. And the clicks and navigation tools are sort of a proxy for, are they using the materials? I don't know, unless you have an eye tracker machine that could figure out how, and that's what people do a lot. I think in physics they've been doing some of these things about eye tracking, about how do you, and in literacy, eye tracking to figure out, you know, you start here and you go to the diagram and come back and everything, you know. But I don't know how intrusive this will be for someone who's just trying to learn a geometry, you know, the geometry to have a course, you know. But the idea is to think about that relationship between different design components that are supposed to help student learning, and are they using this? And is that helping them to have greater opportunities to learn? So, and would there be other resources like a forum, a chat, or some other things that will create some sort of opportunities for them to discuss ideas and everything and talk about things? Are there other resources that could increase the assessment opportunities? And I know you have the file cards, right, where they ask questions.
No, where I ask questions.
But there's some things that they can ask questions, right? So
That's the movie.
yeah, but there's also the journal, right? When they take the online course, do they do the journal?
Yes, they do.
And how do they submit the journal online? They don't, they just keep it.
I mean, I've tried it all. Sending the journal is impractical because it can only be sent at the end of the semester. So I've tried, they have the opportunity to go to the trouble of scanning the journal
Yeah.
and sending page samples to me. Am I doing the right thing? That's fine. But we don't, you know, the journal is not one of the course materials. I mean, it is a course material, but it's theirs. It's not assessed. There's no way of assessing it. Right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well,
But some sort of the completion of the journal is what you sort of.
they use it on the final.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a bad journal, they won't do well on the final.
Therein lies your assessment in their total performance, but it sounds like they're trying to figure out what to measure, what's important, and they're still sort of at the beginning stages of figuring out, okay, this is what correlates to this is what correlates to that, and how to make something fully effective. So if they're still in the experimental stages, people are going to get fully around and find what works, probably before all the studies tell them what works. They'll kind of know, and it'll matriculate out, they'll figure it out.
Well, Michael, on the subject of journals, I now have 20 years worth of data, self-reported. The students are always asked at the end of the semester, was the journal of any use to you other than during exams? Similar, a set of such questions. Remember, you helped me with rewording some of those questions. The problem is that I can't get the university to provide me with scantrons so that this data can not only be collected but actually processed. So I've got stacks and stacks of pieces of paper with pencil marks on them waiting for somebody to do something with it.
Well, I meant more in a general sense of what she was talking about, the hyperlinks and all the different things like that. We were going to what they were measuring and how effective it would be. I think they're still figuring out what's the most important.
Well, the only thing to do there is to do a controlled experiment, right? Half the class, all the hyperlinks are broken, and the other half of the class, the hyperlinks are not broken, and you'll see, but you can't do that with people. No, we're not the NIH. You can't do blind studies.
I wouldn't pay $1,500 to go through that.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So, I don't know.
I think that
No, go ahead.
I think that the cluster analyses that they do are very important, because if you look at the first cluster, that was, you know, motivated students who are self-motivated and they're very good learners. They can survive and do very well in many different situations and many different designs of courses. You know, they'll find the resources that they need, they will make use of them, and they generally will succeed. it seems like if you take good students and you put them in almost any environment, they will do well. So then it becomes a question of how can you really make their experience even better and give them more opportunities to learn. But then there's also this huge component of students who just want to, do the minimum that's required to pass the course, and that's where it really becomes crucial to find these things, because if you can increase their time on task in certain cases, then it will probably at some point correlate with them, learning the material a bit more. And so I think the cluster sort of analysis and identifying the different types of students that do end up enrolling, and then using that to study the different tools that are available to students is probably kind of the way to go.
I was also thinking that, there have been also studies about student interest. And I was thinking, what if one theme is more relevant for a student than another theme, in the course, and they feel like when they talk about this theme is more important than the other theme, but I don't know how fine-grained, because in a way it's the whole experience of the course, and it's really hard to measure these things if it's that during this theme they had, it's in the midterms and they had to study with so many exams that really is not about interest, but it's about.
Now, we all have heard of performance-based evaluations. This is something that's coming to us from courtesy of state legislatures and there's political supporters. Now, the next question is, that's all very well. Of course, performance-based performance-based funding of colleges, performance-based promotions of teachers and so forth. Everything is performance-based. That's great. If you're building missiles, you can test the missile and you can afford to lose a few. But you better have some testing methods. So the only thing I can see is standardized testing. In other words, take the testing away from the courses, from the instructors themselves, and simply standardize the testing all the way across. National tests to get into the colleges, we kind of have that already. National tests to graduate. Without passing a test, you don't graduate. I think that's the only way to go. It's the only way you can assess learning.
I certainly hope that's not the future.
You don't? Well, neither do I. But I don't see what's the alternative.
Innovation, diversity, variety, the freedom to innovate, try different things. Some schools will succeed, some will fail. Some teachers will succeed, some will fail. You will never measure all the nuances to make a successful course. You have all the technological elements, you have the physical elements for on-campus courses, you have the interaction of various students that you bring together, the management and teaching skills of the teacher. So many different things that come together that make those things work and make other things not work. That you can study it to death, you can standardize test it to death, but you're going to miss some really great people who might not pass the standardized test, but could take the knowledge base to a whole new level.
True, but
One thing that always seems to be missing from these studies of course design is the teacher, because I keep seeing over and over that it's really important. The student utilization of all these resources seem to vary greatly with how the teacher is actually working with the students. A great example are forums and message boards, or the Illuminate chat that George has, right? Some students, if the teacher is sort of not very engaged, doesn't hold students' feet to the fire, students won't show up to a lot of those online sessions and such. But if you strike fear into the hearts of the students, some of them will show up a lot more. So it seems like the instructors play an extremely important role in how students will utilize these features, and none of these studies seem to really take that into account.
Well, I was deliberate. I was not looking for that.
Oh, right,
so
it's just more of a general
so
comment
I've been looking at like design elements of the online component that sort of can help the teacher to say, this is what you should know, and the student, this is what I should
Right.
know, and sort of help them navigate.
now, Gloriana, as you do this, do you also consider cost? Different innovations in online delivery have different costs associated with it. So unless,
I said this is not my area of expertise. What I've been trying to model is to say, if I were to study this, I would study what are the design components here and how they seem to support learning or not in one way or the other one. I was thinking, I mean, this is maybe a bad example, but I'm from Puerto Rico, so I didn't grow up using a scarf. That was not part of my routine. So when I moved to the US in 1993, it was cold, I had to use a scarf. I didn't know how to use a scarf. I would just use something like really crazy. And over time, I would see people how they use a scarf, and I know the ways of putting a scarf that would make me warm or feel better and not choke me. And I am pretty competent at putting on my scarf, right? But no one taught me how to use a scarf. What I mean is that I was thinking about this when I thought about online resources, that we sort of learn about different resources because we use the web, because we have experience with textbooks, and we know that the important result comes in a blue box and things like that. So there are different design elements that we just know them because we're part of the world. But do we know whether they have an effect on learning or not? We don't, and I don't know if we can measure that. That's the question about that you said. Should we be measuring the time spent clicking on something, how many clicks people do and everything? That's really a proxy to see if people are using things in a way that matters. But what I mean is that there's not really a theory about designing online resources. And something so complex like a geometry course that includes, you know, the proofs and the diagrams and this and that, it's even harder to think about, is there a theory that will support the design of these components? So, I mean, that was my scarf metaphor in terms of like, I think that there are components that we know have a sense of this may work, but how do we know if this has an effect on the learner? And if they're using them in a way that is helping them? Or is there a way that, you know, are there different learners and different types of learners will use things in different ways?
Okay, let's compare two possible methods of evaluating these things, assessment. We can pay the teachers to get together in conventions and talk to each other and exchange ideas and use as our empirical database the experience of actual human beings. Or we can follow the industrial model, which completely discounts the anecdotal experience and insists on metrics, objective metrics, and only objective metrics matter. For example, No Child Left Behind is based exclusively on metrics and totally ignores any experience of the people who actually do the teaching. Now, we all agree that the former is the right way to do it, but how do we convince that the latter is pretty much useless? How do we convince our suits over in Henry administration building?
Why don't you make the politicians take the performance test?
If the politicians were able to take performance tests of any kind, they would do something better than politics. Yeah, no. Metrics is a real, that performance-based funding is of course based on so-called objective metrics. I can measure the how close a screw that comes off the assembly line fits the specifications. It's pretty hard to do that with people.
Yeah, and that's why there are qualitative studies, or bringing a focus group session and ask them, you know, how was your experience here and there, and interview data and looking at them after they have taken
I mean, there are metrics like how many people graduate. Or, for example, speaking of online universities, how many of your online university students pay off their student loans eventually? How many of you?
No. Yeah, that's really hard. But it could be anything like interviewing them about their experience of the course there.
40 years, yeah, but look what we got at the end of that, Michael.
No debt and 12 plus years of work experience.
Right. Okay, so what do you have, what's your advice? Come on, you gotta make a conclusion.
No, I don't have conclusions. I just had questions. I don't have a conclusion.
Do you have methods of evaluating, do you know, do you guys are?
I'm not an online person. I'm not
Oh,
even
okay.
a learning
Can you
person, but
measure stuff? Are
I
you good at generating metrics?
am I? No.
Just good at generating questions that drive other people to develop metrics.
Yeah, I mean, there's people in my building know more about online resources and things like that than I do.
There are forums that are used to evaluate online courses. There's what Jim Woody calls the quacky one. It's LAS modified version of a standard form. And it categorizes things into, for example, student-student communication, student-instructor communication, etc. And it's like this detailed list that you have to fill out. But the answers are still more qualitative rather than quantitative. So,
Well, according to the central limit theorem, sufficiently great number of qualitative answers become quantitative. Right? So,
I think at the end of the day, you're going to have some combination of metrics with some combination of formative. It's just a matter of what balance works for what teacher, of course. This may all be more of here are the design tools that are available for your course. And each teacher with their particular personality and preference will have to choose the tools that best convey their material and coverage and what they want to teach their students. And before you can pick all
Okay.
those tools, you have to go through these
okay, so Michael, would you say that one of our jobs in NetMath is not only to teach the math, but also the tools that are involved, so that a lot of the people we teach are, of course, teachers. So then by teaching them the tools as well as the subject matter, they can do just what you said.
Exactly. They're going to have to learn the current tools. Because in my day, we had graphic calculators. If you didn't know the graphic calculator, you weren't going to get through the trig course. In modern age, you have to be able to use the digital tools, which are still evolving.
At the same time, maybe we need to be deliberate about teaching people how to navigate the materials, right? If there's a, how, maybe we put a hyperlink here and there, we don't assume that they're going to click on that.
Okay, I'm going to wrap this up because some of us actually do have to leave. First of all, I want to point out that the developer of this course, co-developer, or really, is sitting right there, Michael Summers.
Yeah.
And you were looking at a great deal of Michael's work there. Yeah. But one thing that fell by the wayside was the hyperlink. In subsequent development, I gave up on the hyperlink. And let me tell you why. A hyperlinked text is a topological graph, whereas a textbook or even in a structured online course without hyperlinks is a tree, which is also a graph, but it's not a multiply connected graph. And multiply connected graphs are much harder for people to conceptualize than trees. And so I have saved myself, I've spared myself the effort of maintaining hyperlinks, which is hard to do when you edit and rename things. The hyperlinks just fall apart. So hyperlinks have gone by the wayside. On the other hand, you asked about how do we know that the students read the material. One of the last things that Mike helped create was the file card system, and that's still unfinished, but it's moving along. I mean, here's one of my TAs, Brian. You actually took the course. Actually took that course. This one.
Yeah.
Gloriana.
2009, yeah, fall.
Yeah. Okay. That's good. So you have a student. Right. And so the instant question with substantive answer is something I stole, by the way, Michael Rasky, you'll be happy to hear that. I stole that idea from NetMath, from Calculus and Mathematica, of course, because the notebooks are exactly that. You've got you mentors and see that the students are doing the work. Right. Okay, I think we should thank Gloriana.
Thank you.
Before anybody gets up,